We all have the ability to access flow. It's not an easy state to be able to access. It's quite difficult to access flow. However, it is accessible, and that we can get better at it through training our psychological skills.
Dr. Sue Jackson, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much, Paul, for having me on your show.
It is an absolute pleasure, and it's a real pleasure to actually talk about what we're going to talk about, which is all about flow state. But you refer to yourself as a performance psychologist, which I love because it crosses across different domains, is kind of focused not on problems, but on about being really good or going from good to great. So just give our listeners a little bit of a high-level tour of your experience, professional experience, academic, that sort of stuff. So I'd put you firmly in the bracket of pracademic.
Pracademic. Oh, that's a nice term too. I hope that one takes some traction, or maybe it already has.
I made it up. I call myself a so somebody who takes all the academic research and then practically applies it to people to help them improve their lives, right?
But yeah. Well, I mean, that's quite close to what I do, Paul. So I began life as an academic and worked in universities in Australia after returning from North America, where I did my master's and PhD in sports psychology at that time. And a lot of what we now call performance psychology is drawn from sports psychology. And obviously, because sports psychology is about helping high performers be able to go to the next level, be the best they can be. And so it's that application to anyone who's seeking to be the best they can be, no matter who that is nor what the context is. And so I transitioned out of a academic role to a practitioner role in performance psychology in 2007. And that's the space that I've been working in. And also I'm an author. I like to write. And I guess that's kind of what drew me into the academic world, really, was enjoying writing, enjoying that analytical process of research, but primarily like being able to make a difference. So that's why I am now practicing as what do you call it? A pracademic.
Pracademic performance psychologist. So let's talk about flow state. So you've written a book, an Amazon bestseller, no less. Well done. I tip my hat to you. All about experiencing flow. So let's just start from the start. A lot of people will have heard of flow, but I see it misused a lot around the internet. And I see people, consultants, talking about being in a permanent state of flow.
Oh, okay. Well, good luck to them. I don't know what they're on.
That's exactly what I was thinking. So you worked with the great man himself. I'll give a terrible pronunciation, Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi. Who can you correct me on that?
The Mihaly was great, and Mihaly translates to Mike. So was known by Mike. He passed in 2021 at the good age of 87, and so Mike Csikszentmihalyi. So the last name is Csikszentmihalyi.
Okay, cool. So talk to us. So you had the pleasure of working with him for a bit of time. Can you give us a really good definition of what flow state is?
Oh, I hope so. And I think that, as you said, many people are familiar with flow, but I also agree that there's probably different definitions or ideas about it bouncing around. And so one of the reasons for writing my recently released book, Experiencing Flow, was to try to help people to understand what flow is. So basically, flow is a state when you're totally focused on the task at hand. So that's the most simple experience of it. And it occurs when you're in a challenging situation and you have the skills and you trust those skills to be able to meet the challenge. So you basically take yourself out of your comfort zone, which I'm sure you'd be happy to hear me use that word. And so, we take ourselves out of our comfort zone by stretching boundaries, maybe stretching the challenge a little bit higher than what we might be entirely comfortable with. And that combined with skills to match that challenge, that is kind of like the first and main precondition to being able to experience this state when you get totally engaged in what you're doing.
Yeah. And this is where I see it bastardized, because people on the internet talk about being in flow state all day long and being in flow state when you're relaxed. But challenge is critical to it, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Challenge is critical. And that's always been a component of Mike. I'm going to use the word Mike to refer to Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi because that's a lot more accessible for people. And Mike always was referring to a level of challenge being present. As to what that level of challenge is, we're talking about a subjective experience. So basically it does come down to one's perceptions. So the same person or two people can perceive the same objective challenge quite differently, right? And so it really comes down to how you perceive the challenge, and then also how you perceive your skills, your capabilities. Have you got what it takes to meet that challenge? So you need to get that balance right.
Yeah, and I think this plays into the whole idea of challenge or threat. Which I talk a lot about in terms of, I'm not sure if you're familiar with the hardiness literature.
A little bit, yeah.
Yeah, and so this idea that there can be a potentially stressful / challenging situation. One person may view it as a challenge and the other person may view it as a threat. We know if that person views it as a threat, it has a different impact on the cardiovascular system, a negative impact, and it activates cortisol. Whereas if they view it as a challenge, it actually has a positive impact on the cardiovascular system and activates the fight or flight response, the more adaptive part. But I think what a lot of people don't get about the challenge and threat, it's just like, oh, it's got to be a mindset. Just have a positive mindset. This is challenge. This is challenge. In order for you to really view it as a challenge, you have to be confident that you have the skills to meet it, right?
Absolutely.
So
yeah,
that's kind of flow there, really, isn't it? I mean, that those elements come into it. Are there any other elements about being in a flow state? And then on the back of that, can it be both physical and mental, emotional, psychological, or are there any particular constraints around it?
Okay. So just to take one step back, when you're talking about challenge or threat, if anybody has seen the model of subjective experience that is used to illustrate flow and where flow is positioned in terms of subjective experience, and that model is in my book and it's also available in other sources. But basically, if you think of a pie graph and there's like 8 channels in this pie graph, so you've got challenges on one axis and skills on the other axis. So flow is that channel where both your challenges and your skills are being extended. And then if you were to go like to the left of that, then you get to a state of arousal. And then from there to a state of anxiety. So, it's very similar in terms of what you're calling threat. It's very close. It's fine-tuned, right? It could be a challenge one moment and then the next moment it's a threat. And it does come down very much to our perceptions, but also to our psychological skills and how well we're able to sort of notice where our focus is and bring it back if it's not in the right place.
So I'm really becoming more and more interested in attention and in attentional control. Was involved in a Delphi study all around high performance cognition. And all of the experts in the study, we were all asked to rate trainable cognitive primaries that underpin high performance cognition. And every single person agreed that the most important part of performance under pressure was attentional control. How does that play into flow? I mean, you hinted at it a little bit there.
Yeah, well, I mean, if the very most simple definition of flow is when you've got your total attention on the task that you're doing at the present time. Now, that is something that's hard for most of us to sustain.
Particularly these days, right?
Particularly these days, exactly. And that is why mindfulness has become so important in life these days, is because we're dealing with so much that is a potential distraction or a real distraction. And so being able to train our attentional skills through mindfulness, I think is really critical in terms of being able to have an awareness of where our attention is. Like, as you would be very familiar, Paul, like through mindfulness, we develop greater awareness of where our attention is. So like without developing some sort of psychological skill, be it mindfulness, be it breathing, something along the lines that helps develop our awareness, then we start to notice, oh, actually my attention isn't on task. But also mindfulness obviously gives us the skill set to bring that attention back to the present moment. So I think, and in my book, I spend quite a bit of time discussing how mindfulness can be a pathway to flow. And for me, it is a really relevant pathway to flow. And without that ability to pay attention and to refocus attention, flow is not going to happen.
Yeah, absolutely. Because, we can think in this model, because I can picture the flow is in the top right, then you go left, you have arousal, and then you have anxiety. And that can be when thoughts creep into your mind, right? Negative self-talk creeps into your mind, and you can all of a sudden snap out of a flow state and back into, through arousal and into threat pretty quickly. But that self-awareness is really critical, isn't it, of where my attention actually is?
Yeah, self-awareness. And then I think an ability to be okay with what you're talking about, which is those like self-doubts that come into our experience, and be able to not like give them too much power, like in our mind, not give them too much space. And one of the things that we haven't, there are actually 9 dimensions of flow, but I'm sure we'll touch on them. But one of the things that makes flow as enjoyable an experience as it is that during flow, we let go of self-consciousness. So we drop that sense of, is this okay? Am I okay? What are they thinking of me? And because it's really hard to not be self-conscious in the lives that we live, it's a lovely experience that we can then look back on and say, oh, wow, that was great. I wasn't so caught up in my own head during that time. And the reason that we're not self-conscious in flow is it comes back to that key component, is that you're totally focused on the task at hand. So if you are actually 100% focused on the task at hand, you can't simultaneously have some percent also on worry about yourself. It just doesn't add up, right? And so it's about training our ability to be able to know where our attention is and to bring it back again and again.
Yeah, if we could just create a button that people could press where they could drop self-consciousness, the world would be so much of a better place, wouldn't it? And people's lives would be so much better, because so many people spend so much time living in their head. So in Japanese psychology, which my wife's a practitioner of, they say the most important thing that you in control of in your life is the flashlight of your attention.
I like that.
And I love that, because whatever you pay attention to, your brain commits cells to it.
Absolutely.
Right? That's the key thing. So gaining control of that flashlight, I think, not only really critical for flow state, but I think it's really critical for our overall well-being and,
I think
the quality
you're right.
of our life.
Like how happy we are, for sure, because for most of us, narcissists excluded, perhaps, being caught up in our own heads and thinking about ourselves, it's pretty negative, right? Like it doesn't take long for us to be reminded about some reason why we're not good enough, we're not this enough, and so on, and that's just a downward spiral. And so, that's one of the greatest challenges, isn't it, to be able to let go of that. But like that analogy about that flashlight of your attention. So like if you were to think about having that flashlight of attention totally on whatever it is you're engaged in, you could think of that as being like a flow state, right? Because you're totally engaged in what's in front of you or what you've decided to focus your attention on.
How different? I see, as you were talking about that, I was gardening last weekend and I just found myself, I was putting out weeds and I was just fascinated by the resilience of the weeds and how different weeds have got different roots. And I caught myself in actual flow state, gardening, right? So flow state, a lot of people I think a natural thing that comes to mind is sport, right? And I think anybody who's done sport will be aware of that loss of self-consciousness, the high demands, high challenge, but also you've got the skills to meet it, and kind of time just melts a little bit. But I presume there you can be in flow state in so many different areas of your life.
Yes, and sport was actually the area that I was initially most interested in looking at it, because I was studying for my master's and then my PhD in sports psychology. And I stumbled across the concept of flow, and immediately there was a language for those times when, as an athlete myself, I had been totally engaged in what I was doing and generally performed to my highest level in whatever that activity was, and remember it as being special. Like, no matter what the outcome actually was, it was that experience of being in flow. And as I said, when I read the first book on flow that I did, which was called Beyond Boredom and Anxiety, it was like, oh, there's actually this thing, there's this concept, there's psychologists studying this. And in this first book, Beyond Boredom and Anxiety, as well as athletes, Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, he studied chess players, he studied
I can see
musicians, dancers, and he studied surgeons. And so very different activities. And there was this consistency of experience, consistency of reported subjective experience, even though what a chess player is doing is different to a surgeon mid-procedure. When we're looking at, well, what is it like when you're totally involved in what you're doing? The characteristics do tend to have some consistency across different types of activities and settings.
Okay. Now, I sort of derailed you a little bit. Let's now go back and talk about the 9 different dimensions of flow. So one of them was dropping self-consciousness, was it?
Yep. So total focus on the task at hand is another one. We've also covered a challenging activity. So that's that challenge skill balance. It's not just a challenging activity, but that there's this balance between challenges and skills. You've got clear goals about what you are doing in the situation, and you get immediate feedback as you're going that helps you to stay on task. And just to pause there a moment in terms of why is sport so conducive to flow? Well, if we just think about sport has graded levels of challenge that we can always place ourselves into an appropriate level of challenge for our present skill set. And so we can extend ourselves a little bit, but not too much. So we've got that challenge skill balance, and in sport, that's just something that there's really no limits, right? We can just keep challenging ourselves. As we see in the greatest athletes in whatever sport, they are always pushing the boundaries. Like the recent Olympics, for example, in Paris, we saw so many examples of that. Anyway, so we've got your challenge skill balance in sport. You've also got clear goals in sport. Like, it's because each sport has its own set of rules, its own set of expectations about what you do within that sport. It's very clear, like you've got clarity as you're going along. And because you're moving your body, you're getting feedback from many sources, including from your body, about how you're going. So this idea of having a challenging activity, graded levels of challenge, an activity where there are clear goals and you're getting feedback, is one of the reasons that sport is very conducive to flow.
Makes sense.
Having said that, there are other activities that you could probably say would also have those 3 what are called preconditions to flow.
So they are preconditions: the challenging and the skill balance, the clear goals, and the immediate feedback. Okay, cool. And then there was 4 more that we didn't get to.
Yes. Okay. So we've got, as a result of the total focus on the task, you have a characteristic called action awareness merging. And that's where you and the activity that you're doing, or you and the task, tend to meld into one. And that is also related to this loss of self-consciousness. And so like a cyclist might describe the bike as an extension of their body. They're just one machine moving in the same direction. A musician might describe the instrument as an extension of their hand, say, and that it's all this sense of oneness. So that's another characteristic. We've got a sense of control in flow. So people like to feel in control. Having said that, control is a slightly different state in this channel model of subjective experience to flow. But it's the sense of like you worry about failing.
Geez, how important is that in sports psychology, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So that's another one, is sense of control. Time transformation, which is an interesting one. I think of all of the 9 dimensions, it's this sense of time passes differently. When you are engaged in something, it can be a conversation, it can be a sports activity, it can be playing your musical instrument, it could be attending a concert, whatever it is. When you have this experience of flow during it, the sense of time often seems to pass differently. And again, it comes back to this simple one of you're paying attention to the task. So you're not sort of, okay, so what time is it now? How much longer have I got? Again, comes back to attention. And then the last of the 9 characteristics, Paul, is called autotelic experience, which is really the culmination of having these other 8 factors all happening together, is that we have what's known as an autotelic experience, which means intrinsically rewarding or enjoyable, as in we enjoy it, and we may not enjoy it at the time, as in we might not have awareness at the time that, oh, wow, this is really enjoyable. But when we look back on it, we definitely perceive it as an enjoyable experience.
Yeah, very interesting. That time transformation, I just bookmarked a research paper this morning, which I'm going to go back, where they have identified neurons in the brain that are responsible for the concept of time. And wouldn't it be interesting to see if in flow states, those neurons are quietened down?
Wow, that would be really exciting.
Yeah, it's just
specific neurons.
Specific neurons. I'll flick you the research paper whenever we're done. Because I think that might be an area you might be interested in exploring, because people will understand that time just kind of changes, right? And as you were going through all that stuff, you know what popped into my head was when I was doing flying training back in the military, 1998, I think it was. And we were doing advanced flying training in helicopters. I was doing anti-submarine warfare. And what you do in the flying training is you do graded flights, and each one you do a simulator, and then you go out and do a real thing where and the first one is so simple. You go out there, there's a submarine on the surface, right? And you see the submarine, it goes underwater and it goes in a straight line, and then we've got to track it. And then the culmination of this is what's called a thirsty war, which I don't know if it still happens, but every Thursday off the coast of the UK, NATO would run exercises where it was war games. And there was a whole heap of ships and helicopters and submarines involved in this war gaming. And I remember we were really caught behind on weather, and we were to do our third flight and everything was just backing up. So they said, like, we're just going to go out and do a thirsty war. You guys know this is going to be challenging. And we took off and went out there. And I remember we joined, and it was pandemonium. There was 2 radios in my ears. There was all these contacts on the radars. We're trying to get in. It's dark. The pilots are hassling me. And I had a complete brain implosion. It is the first, probably and only ever complete meltdown that I have had. And the instructor had to take me out of the seat. And he did it. And then we went back and they debriefed, and it turns out the guy in the other helicopter, Simon, had the exact same experience, right? He had a complete meltdown. And then about 3 weeks later, or maybe 4 weeks later, we went out and did another thirsty war. And we both did really well, and time went like that. And that was because we had increased our skill level in between, right? But it was exactly what you're saying, that if the challenge is too high for your skills, you go out. And I went in about 9 seconds all the way into anxiety / brain implosion, right? But then few weeks pass and you increase your skills, and that's what they do, that graded complexity on each flight and stepping into that so that you increase your skill level. So it's just a little bit of an example that popped into my head that kind of explained everything. All of the elements of flow were in that.
And so when you're experiencing what you called a brain implosion and like really high levels of anxiety, you had to like step out of that situation, right? It wasn't possible that you could bring your anxiety level down sufficiently to continue. And also in that type of scenario, that just probably isn't safe. So
yes, that's
I
right.
Understand.
It was a complete safety thing, and it was just
absolutely.
because it was dark, it was cloudy.
Oh, right.
The pilots needed to know where the other helicopters were, and I just had a complete another meltdown. The one and only, I think, complete brain implosion that I've had in my life, right? And it was just I guess the pressure of the situation as well, right? So it's not like sport where you can just tap out a little bit. But
yeah, true.
So and that leads me into, are there any particular personality types or professions that tend to lend themselves more towards flow states?
That's a really great question. Csikszentmihalyi actually talked about and wrote about the autotelic personality, which is exactly that. It's a type of person that is more likely to be able to experience flow. And some of the qualities that make someone autotelic is that they tend to seek out challenge, and they tend to be intrinsically motivated towards most of the things that they're doing. And rather than definitely, we've always got some intrinsic, some extrinsic reasons behind what we're doing, but this sense of in a high level of intrinsic motivation, challenge seeking, high level of resilience, and good skills at being able to pay attention. And then what Mike referred to an autotelic personality as the people of flow, actually, I think that's a really nice term, like the people of flow. Yeah, these people are more likely to be able to experience flow in whatever it is they're doing. Now, having said that, everything that we talked about in terms of flow and what makes up flow, it's all trainable. So we can become more autotelic. It's not just there's this gene for autotelic personality. You've either got it or you don't. Like Csikszentmihalyi would say that we all have the ability to access flow. He would also say it's not an easy state to be able to access. It's quite difficult to access flow. However, it is accessible, and that we can get better at it through training our psychological skills, which is then where my work is based, is about what sort of psychological skills are we going to help you with. And that is very much an individual question, I think. Like there are certain standard things like attention we've talked about quite a bit here. Attention's always important. We can always improve. Most of us can improve our ability to pay attention. But some people would be more prone to self-consciousness, so you might spend more time in that space, like helping somebody. Somebody may be prone to anxiety and helping them manage that. And it's not about trying to get rid of anxiety, because, that's like a losing game anyway. But, anxiety is close to flow if you think about this model that I'm describing. So if we can learn to trust ourselves in a situation that it's safe for us to remain in, unlike your example there, then we can shift from anxiety into flow.
Sorry, so just on that, and I love that you said not getting rid of anxiety, because I hate that expression, getting rid of anxiety. But how much of that helping someone with anxiety to experience flow state involves increasing their skill level or their perception of their skill level?
Yeah. Are you saying, is it either or is it?
Well, that's a kind of a continuum, really, isn't it? Because sometimes they have the skills, but they don't perceive that they have it.
That's exactly the case. And so the higher the challenge that one's involved in, generally, you've got skills that are helping you to be able to be in that challenging zone, whatever that challenging zone is. And therefore, actually, the higher we go in terms of elite performance in whatever domain, those performers tend to have great skills. They tend to have pretty outstanding levels of skills. However, doubt comes in. Right? That's a human characteristic, is that for most of us, doubt's going to come in. And so it is, I think, at the higher levels of performance that we're talking about, high-level performers, it's very much about the trust in the skills. Whereas at the lower levels, it might be you simply don't have the skills and you've got to develop them.
Yeah, for sure. And how much does discomfort tolerance or distress tolerance play into this?
Yeah, well, I think that's an area you can probably talk to pretty well, right?
Yeah.
With your work. And I think it's being comfortable with being uncomfortable, which is kind of like a skill in anxiety management is just that. It's learning to be comfortable with these changes in physiology that are happening that come with heightened arousal, and not like putting a whole bunch of negative, unhelpful labels on those, but just like recognizing, oh, my heart's beating faster, or my palms are sweaty here, or, and being okay with that. And then, if you are in that anxiety channel, then learning to be okay with that as well. And another skill or psychological approach that I bring into my work is acceptance and commitment therapy, which
my wife's a practitioner, and I love ACT.
Right, okay.
I love it because
ACT.
it's action focused, right?
It is. It's action focused, and also that first word, acceptance, that's like a way of managing anxiety, is to accept it. So to answer your question, accepting the discomfort. It doesn't mean that you want it. It doesn't mean that you're going to like go and seek it out. But like if it's showing up, just being able to be, oh, yeah, okay, so this is my experience right now. What am I going to do in light of that? And that's where your attention skills come in. Well, what am I going to do in light of that? Well, I'm going to choose to focus on this because this matters to me. So,
yeah, absolutely. I tell you, if I was czar of the language universe, I would ban the word anxiety and replace it with over-arousal.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Yeah. Yeah, well, as you know from what I've described with the flow model, or the model of subjective experience, there's flow, and then there's arousal, and then there's anxiety, and then there's worry. And so, arousal can be a neutral state to be in. It could be perceived as a neutral state to be in. And it's only when we start putting the labels on it that then it's like, oh no, I don't want to be here. I feel terrible.
And we medicalize it as well, right? That's
absolutely.
Anyway, that's a whole nother podcast. So tell me this: is there a difference between flow state and what people report as being in the zone, or this concept of deep work? Are they just both alternative words for flow state? Yeah,
really interesting. Well, being in the zone is a colloquial term for flow, I think.
Yeah, I think so.
I think that that term's been around a long time, particularly in sport. But in other domains, being in the zone is probably not that meaningful. But definitely in sport, that's a term that's used that athletes and coaches talk about. And I think that they may well be talking about flow. In terms of deep work and Cal Newport's work there, so deep work is a state of total focus on the task at hand, and it's not my concept, so I couldn't say whether it's flow. I think it could be flow, but I don't know that
I think it's
necessarily
conditional,
is.
Right? Because as you said, some of the key things, the key elements, challenge and skill balance, because you can be doing deep work that either you don't have the skill for or is quite easy, but you're just focused, right?
True.
So I think it's probably contextual, right?
That makes sense.
And I guess that's where those prerequisites, was it the challenge and skill balance, the clear goals and immediate feedback?
Yes, that's exactly right.
So they're the ones that differentiate from these other states potentially.
And from mindfulness as well.
Yeah. Okay, cool. That makes sense. So tell me, with your time working with Mihaly or Mike, what were the biggest lessons that you learned?
And this is something that I go into right in the start of my book, and a big motivation to write Experiencing Flow was to honor the work of Mike Csikszentmihalyi, and to try to help to build awareness of it through whatever ways I can in my own small way to help people to understand what flow is. And I think Mike embodied the work that he was engaged in. Having spent time with him, we wrote a book together called Flow in Sports in 1999 because we both shared a passion for sport, and he was encouraging of my master's and PhD work in that area. And so Mike was always curious. There was never a bad question, a silly question. It was always asking questions and seeking to become the best version of himself. And I think in my book, I go in a little bit to his background, having grown up in wartime and having experienced the chaos and the uncertainty of that. That was probably one of the influences in his life, and also just the time in which he grew up in. There's an environment in which we growing up in and living in. But Mike, Mike embodied somebody who was always looking to understand more and to want others to share and understand through his writings what this concept of flow was. So he's written many books, and I'd really encourage anyone that's at all interested in what we're talking about here to check out any or all of his different books that he's written. So he's written in the work of business, he's written in the field of creativity, and he's written in the realm of evolving self. So he's very much into complexity and growth in complexity. He's written about flow in daily life. And so, like, Mike was an extraordinary thinker, and I feel very grateful to have had an opportunity to have learnt from him.
Yeah, he's a bit of a legend, isn't he, really? So tell me this, so you work with a lot of individuals around helping them and organizations, helping them to get into flow state. What are some of the common barriers that you see with individuals and with teams? And you can take those in any order you want.
I think we've touched on some of those barriers. One is distractibility. Another is self-doubts and that inner critic. And that's that tendency to get caught up in ourselves, which is so easy to do, when things aren't going well. So in terms of like barriers, I think also like the type of society we live in where technology is so much key to everything we do, and other people have written about this, is like we're training ourselves, and the lives that we have and all of the technology in front of us is actually training distractibility a lot of the time versus paying attention to one thing for a sustained amount of time. And so I think that, those are some key challenges. In terms of teams, I have looked at, and there are researchers that are specifically looking at flow in teams. Jeff Vanderhout in the Netherlands is one of those people. And what I found when I've interviewed athletes, whether they're in team sports or individual sports, is that difference with the team aspect of whether the team can get into flow or you can get into flow in that team situation is how well is the team playing, because it's no longer just you.
Yes.
So it comes down to team performance.
Yeah. There's
but
more
also
variables, isn't there? There's more variables,
much more variables. But also the communications, something that comes up is like, what's the type of communications? What's the nature of communications? Because that's a source of feedback, right? So keeping those positive and task focused will help a group or a team to be able to maybe tap into flow.
And one of the biggest ones, challenge, not stress. Challenge.
Yes, exactly. Like perceptions.
Yeah. And then, so look, I think you've hinted at some of them, that what individuals can do to kind of enhance flow in their lives, whether it's in their workplace or at home. I think one thing that would be pretty bloody obvious is put your goddamn mobile phone away. I think That's got to be a prerequisite. Unless you get into, I don't think it's possible to get into flow state when you're doom scrolling, right?
I don't know. Having said that, like gaming is an area that, some people will report experiencing flow in, and it has been studied because it's more of a controlled or potentially more of a controlled environment, you can control more variables. But I think, yeah, deciding if you're going to be involved in a task and your phone isn't part of that task, then having it on silent makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because otherwise there will be distractions.
Yeah, there's a really cool study called Brain Drain, that I often start my talks with, and it showed that if your mobile phone is sitting on the table upside down on silent, it reduces your working memory capacity and your fluid intelligence by at least 10%.
Really?
Yeah, it's very cool. So that just people think that just having it on the desk upside down, it's still a bloody attention thief, right?
Because you know what the phone's associated with, and
Correct.
so yeah.
Correct. So a bit of an
That's very interesting.
yeah, definite enemy of flow. Something that just popped into my head: are there particular brain states or signatures? Like, has this been investigated in functional MRI scanners or any other type of imaging technology?
Yes, there has been some research in that area. It's not the easiest area of research, as you can imagine, because...
Yes, and if you've ever been in an MRI scanner, you'll know they're not particularly conducive to flow states.
To flow, yeah. So as technology, like we've kind of been giving technology a bad rap, but as technology continues to improve and we get better, more accurate in situ ways of looking at what's going on in the brain, while people are engaged in their activity, we will come to understand what's happening more. But, obvious things like reduced levels of beta brainwave frequency, less activity in the default brain network, some physiological measurements of like ease and fluidity in terms of that synchronization between brain and body that occurs when we're in flow and so on. So yes, it is being looked at. And I think it is a very exciting area for future research.
Yeah, absolutely. And are people, when they're in flow, do they have to be in alpha brainwave states, or can you be in low beta and still be in flow? Because that challenge would seem to suggest, or the arousal. Well, maybe that's the demarcation between where arousal turns into flow.
Yeah, interesting area, and I probably can't provide you with a simple answer on that one, but I think that beta excludes flow. But I guess it's and we've always got, we've got more than alpha and beta brainwaves happening, and so, the role of theta and gamma and so on, like it's not an area that I can comment on specifically. But I think, as I said, as we get better at being able to tap into what's going on inside people's heads, we'll come to understand a bit more about that psychophysiology of flow. However, there was just one thing that came to mind as I was talking there, is that Mike was always cautious about trying to pin flow down too much, like to say it's this and it's not that, because of his attitude, his curiosity, and his not wanting to sort of like be too black and white. And also he didn't want to oversimplify what is a very complex psychological state. And I think that that's probably one of the concerns in the popular media is perhaps an oversimplification of what is quite a complex psychological state and not an easy state for people to get into.
Yeah. And these people who tell you can be in flow all day long are just complete and utter charlatans, right?
Well, I think that I'd probably have to agree with you on that, Paul. Like, it's just like you can't run a marathon 24 hours a day. Like, it's about balance. It's about times of focus and times of restoration and recovery. It's not sustainable, even if it was possible, because you'd wear yourself out because of the high level of intensity.
Yes.
That is involved. And I mean, after a flow experience, you might be feeling tired because you've brought all of your resources to a very challenging activity.
I think that is a really good point, because it really is complete resource, certainly brain resource, and depending what you're doing, a lot of physical resources as well, particularly if it's sport, right? So, the idea that you can be in this for huge periods of time, I think, is completely ridiculous. and not have self-awareness and all of that sort of stuff. It's preposterous.
It's also it's incorrect to sort of think that there's just a switch that we can turn on and we can, like, I've seen and written, or I've not written about, but I've read people writing about hacking the flow state. Like, let's just find ways to hack into this, like, for me, again, I'm not supportive of that. I'm more supportive of, well, and this is what I think I could speak for Mike here, is like, let's become more psychologically complex selves by developing the skills necessary to be able to access flow in a challenging situation versus find some way to just, let's just hack into it. That just, to me, it cheapens what's a very rich experience.
Yeah, totally agree. Last few questions. It's year 12 for students. My daughter's in the throes of it right now, coming up to exams. Presumably integrating flow into educational settings is a great idea. Any thoughts on that? And then any little tips for any parents that might be listening that get somebody in year 12 to help them get into that flow with their studies?
Yeah, well, I think what we were saying, flow is about a challenging situation. So your year 12 exams, there you go. You've got your challenging situation. Tick, that's ticked. So have you got the skills at this point in time? Well, let's hope so, because you've applied yourself over your years of schooling. So now it's about trusting the skills that you do have. It's no time for self-doubt. It's no time for, well, what haven't I gone over, or what don't I understand? It's about focusing on what skills can you bring to a very high level of challenge, and to provide you with the best performance that you can achieve, and to help you to focus the best that you are able to in each of your exams. And you may or you may not find flow, but you'll certainly you'll do better than what you would if you decided to take a negative attitude and to doubt yourself, right? So in terms of education and flow, positive psychology has been an area that's had a lot of growth, and Csikszentmihalyi actually had a lot to do with the resurgence of positive psychology.
He worked with Seligman, didn't he?
Seligman and Csikszentmihalyi, yeah. And they wrote a great paper in 2000 in American Psychologist where they outlined positive psychology and why it mattered and so on. And flow was situated as a central concept within their model of positive psychology. And so when positive psychology has been uptaken, and I do see that in educational settings, that well-being programs are being offered more by schools and so on. Some of those programs, if they're well-versed in what positive psychology is about, including the flow concept. And one of the leaders in this area in terms of schools within Australia was Geelong Grammar School.
Oh, yep.
Yeah, so Geelong Grammar School had a positive education, or it's called positive education, but incorporating positive psychology principles, has had a long-standing positive education program, and obviously has a lot of resources, and decided to invest in the positive education space. And they brought out Martin Seligman to spend some time at Geelong Grammar School.
That's right, yeah.
And Mike Csikszentmihalyi also had some contribution, as did many leaders in the positive psychology space, into what makes a good positive education program. And so Geelong Grammar School had a flagship, and still does have a flagship positive education program that spurred on a lot of other schools to do likewise. And I just want to mention that one of the key players in that space is a colleague and good friend of mine by the name of John Hendry. And for many years, he's retired now, but over 50 years spent in education. And he was passionate about flow, and he was passionate about, in his director of student welfare at Geelong Grammar School, about incorporating flow into their positive education program.
Awesome.
So shout out to John.
Yeah, cool. Very cool. Last couple of questions. I presume there would be a link between flow states and positive mental health.
Yeah, for sure. I think that that is something that goes hand in hand, right? Because you're challenging yourself, and so you're extending yourself. Mike uses this term growth in psychological complexity through flow experiences. So we are becoming more complex human beings through flow experiences. These experiences are almost always viewed as positive experiences being in flow. And so there's a lot of reasons why there are connections there between flow and positive mental health.
Yeah, and I think there's probably a link there in stuff that you feel proud of, right? So if you've been in flow state, there's generally, I'm kind of proud I achieved that. That was high demand, high skills. And for me,
exactly.
A life that you can be proud of is much better than a life of happiness, particularly as we tend to define it in the West. Are you familiar with the Japanese term of Ikigai?
I have heard of that term.
Do you think there's an overlap here between flow and Ikigai?
I have heard people talk about that overlap. John Hendry would be one of those people. And I probably am not well versed enough in it to comment, but if it's something that you think from what we've been talking about here, do you see parallels between the two?
From what I know, and I interviewed Professor Ken Mogi, Japanese guy who all about Ikigai, and I think there's definitely an overlap. It's probably like a Venn diagram, because Ikigai is stuff that you can be completely immersed in, that you kind of lose the concept of time, but you can have Ikigai that's not particularly challenging. So that's where I think there is that overlap, right? So Ken said one of his Ikigais is making his cup of coffee in the morning and doing a ceremony around it and then sitting down with a piece of chocolate.
Sounds nice.
It's not particularly challenging, but other Ikigais, particularly the centenarians, growing their own vegetables and all of those sorts of things. But I think there would definitely be that overlap in the Venn diagram, particularly if you throw challenge in
definitely.
there. And then I think there is lots of similarities.
Can I just comment on that too? Like, we have talked a lot about challenge skill and high challenge and so on. But in terms of flow in daily life, Csikszentmihalyi has written about that, something that we can achieve. And his book, Finding Flow, The Psychology of Engagement with Everyday Life, published in 1997, was all about that. And he and others have looked at flow in daily life settings. And it's about relative balance of challenges and skills. So, it's not like a super high challenge necessarily, but you're describing that cup of coffee, that act of making a cup of coffee. If you are bringing all of your attention to it and you're trying to make the best cup of coffee that you can, maybe you can experience a bit of flow in that.
Okay. All right. So it doesn't have to be high challenge. That's interesting, right? Because I always thought the challenge had to be quite high.
Well, generally, yes, it is about a high challenge. However, definitely we can experience flow in everyday life, and it comes down to that balance of challenges and skills. So that, like, if the challenge is just nowhere to be seen and we're super skilled, we won't experience flow. We'll experience boredom.
Yeah,
exactly. Yeah,
cool. Very last question: what gives you flow?
Sport has always been for me, or moving my body. So as an older person who has had a wonderful time experiencing a number of different sports, now for me it's about physical activity, and it's about just keeping on moving and finding that sweet spot where the right level of challenge for an aging, injured body can find something that's enjoyable and challenging and that you can develop your skills in. So definitely movement. Reading and writing, again, would be other areas for me that I would say that I've achieved flow in and can achieve flow in.
Very cool.
How about for yourself?
Yeah, look, for me, pretty similar things, actually. The sport stuff, I actually find podcast interviews that you get into a bit of flow, because
absolutely,
there is a little bit of challenge in that you got to follow the conversation, note what you're
Very
saying,
high
and
level of
then think about the next questions and think about the audience interpretation and all of that. So So definitely I would say doing podcast stuff would be, and writing a book for sure, and doing my bloody PhD for sure.
Doing your PhD, yeah. Yeah, well, I think that you've demonstrated, just as a little bit of feedback, because I think feedback, can always be helpful, like just an excellent level of attentional skills there. And so I can imagine that you do experience flow in your podcasting, because I could see you've been taking some notes, for example, but just like staying very engaged. And I think that, your ability to do that is probably a reason why you then say, well, this is one of those areas where I experience flow, which is great. And, for somebody else, it might be that listening to a podcast and what they're learning through that, that could even be a flow experience, like a lower level flow experience too. So yeah, it can be in any activity, as long as we're bringing skills to a challenge and we're finding a match there, and we're bringing all of our attentional resources to what we're doing.
Yeah, very cool. So this has been awesome. Thank you for clearing up some stuff. I've certainly learned a lot about a subject I knew a reasonable amount about. So that's a sign of your expertise. Where can people go to buy the book and find out more? Presumably you work one-on-one, probably corporate stuff as well. So where could people go? Because I think a lot of leaders listening to this going, geez, I need Sue in my business to help with a bit of flow state.
Oh, thanks, Paul. My website's called Body and Mind Flow, bodyandmindflow.com.au. My book that was recently published is called Experiencing Flow, and the subtitle is Life Beyond Boredom and Anxiety. And that's available through Amazon, and recently recorded a audiobook, so soon it'll be available on audio platforms as well. And I have a small social media presence, and people can locate that through my website as well. So yeah, Body and Mind Flow, which kind of is hopefully illustrating my interests, I guess, in terms of bringing things together. It's about that integration of body and mind in whatever we're doing to hopefully experience flow.
You are a lady after my own heart. I tell you that body, brain, mind integration, really critical.
I did notice we had some similarities in our websites, yes. Or our emails anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. So this has been awesome. Thank you very much. And people, go and buy the book and get yourself into flow and put your goddamn mobile phone away. Thanks, Sue.